I woke up that morning with a strange sense of anticipation that made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. The kind of nervous energy that comes before something important but dangerous. And as I looked out the cabin window at the lake, still and glassy in the early light, I felt a moment of peace that I knew would not last, because in the quiet shadows of the trees I sensed eyes watching, not mine, but someone else's, someone who didn't belong here yet had been keeping tabs on me for weeks, someone who thrived on control and confrontation, and my stomach sank as I remembered the letters I had received over the past month. Each one more aggressive than the last, all from Karen, the HOA president, the kind of person who made it her mission to micromanage every lawn, every dock, every small detail of her neighbors' lives, and while I had tried to ignore her in the past, telling myself that her power was only on paper and that the lake cabin, being private property, was my safe place, today felt different. Today felt like a storm was building, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the calm I loved so much was about to be shattered. I moved through the cabin carefully, my fingers brushing over the polished wood of the table, over the stack of documents I had hidden just hours earlier, documents that, if anyone else saw them, could change everything, and I felt a thrill of both fear and hope, because today I was meeting someone far more powerful than Karen, someone whose authority could actually protect me if things went wrong. The state attorney general, and the thought of this high-stakes, secret meeting made my pulse race as I double-checked the coffee brewing on the counter, the recorder tucked into my bag, and the small folder with notes I had carefully prepared, knowing that any misstep could ruin what I had been planning for months. The cabin smelled like pine and damp earth, a comforting scent that I clung to as a shield against the rising anxiety in my chest, and I stepped onto the deck to take in the morning air, feeling the crisp breeze off the lake against my face while my eyes scanned the gravel driveway below, half expecting to see nothing, half expecting to see Karen already lurking at the edge of the trees, clipboard in hand, ready to confront me, and I realized I had been so focused on my preparation that I hadn't fully considered how she might try to interfere, how aggressive she could be, and a chill ran through me as I remembered her reputation for showing up unannounced, for barging into people's homes under the pretense of enforcing rules that no one else understood, and I had to fight the urge to panic, to imagine every possible scenario in which she ruined this moment before it even began. I went back inside and tried to steady my hands, running them along the counter and muttering to myself that I could handle this, that I had a plan, that Karen's authority ended at my property line and that I was not going to let her intimidation win. And as I arranged the papers on the desk and adjusted the chair to face the door, I could feel my heart thumping in my chest like a drumbeat warning me that something was coming, a warning I couldn't ignore. Every creak of the cabin settled my nerves further and then tore at them at the same time because I knew each sound could be the prelude to chaos, and I sat down, taking a deep breath, imagining how the Attorney General would respond if Karen attempted to assert herself. And for a brief moment I let myself hope that the power of the law and the truth would be enough to stop her, that reason and authority could prevail where intimidation had failed. But then I heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel, slow and deliberate, and my stomach dropped as the sound grew closer, echoing across the lake like a warning bell. And I knew in that instant that Karen had arrived, that her presence was imminent, and that the careful calm I had worked so hard to create was about to collide with her relentless force, and my mind raced with possibilities, trying to predict her moves, to anticipate the confrontation before it happened, while the documents I had prepared suddenly felt heavier, as if their weight carried the responsibility of defending everything I had built here, of defending the cabin, the peace of this place, and the secret purpose of my meeting, all at once, and I could feel my pulse in my temples as I listened to the sound of her approaching footsteps on the deck, deliberate, demanding, full of the kind of confidence that only comes from believing rules are on your side even when they are not. And I realized that in the moment she crossed that threshold, everything would change, because this was not just a test of courage or composure. It was the start of a collision between control and authority, between fear and empowerment, and I clenched my fists lightly, willing myself to remain calm as I reminded myself that the Attorney General would arrive any minute, that there were people and rules beyond her reach, and that this confrontation, as terrifying as it was, would not define the outcome. But the tension in the air made every second stretch, and I could feel my heart hammering as the doorknob rattled, the moment before impact where everything hung suspended, where my private sanctuary felt like the stage for a drama I had been waiting my whole life to witness. and I took one final breath, focusing on the lake, the trees, and the documents on the desk, ready to face whatever came. Through that door, knowing that once Karen stepped inside, nothing would be the same again. I heard the door swing open before I saw her, the sound cutting through the cabin like a warning siren, and when I turned, there she was, Karen, standing in the doorway with her clipboard raised as if it were a weapon, her eyes sharp and calculating, scanning the room as if trying to uncover every secret I had carefully hidden, and in that moment, my stomach twisted with a mixture of fear and frustration, knowing that no amount of preparation could have fully braced me for her presence, because Karen did not wait for permission. She did not knock. She simply assumed that anything she wanted to control was hers to command, and her voice, sharp and high-pitched, immediately began firing accusations, questioning my property lines, my landscaping, the angle of the dock, and even the way the sunlight reflected off the water, as if each minor detail were a personal affront to her sense of order. And I stood frozen for a moment, gripping the edge of the desk to steady myself, feeling the weight of every hidden document in that drawer, knowing that this was the exact moment where everything could unravel, where my private sanctuary could be violated in a way that would have consequences I had been carefully planning to avoid. And I tried to speak calmly, to redirect her attention, but her energy was overwhelming, a flood of entitlement and aggression that filled the cabin from corner to corner, and she started pacing, tapping her pen on the hardwood floor, pointing at every surface, while lecturing about rules and responsibilities as if she were the law itself. And I realized in that instant that words alone would not be enough to contain her, that reasoning with Karen was a futile effort, because she thrived on confrontation, on asserting dominance, and the more I resisted, the more energized she became. And yet, even in the swirl of panic rising in my chest, I felt a flicker of determination, reminding myself that I was not alone in this, that someone far more powerful was coming, someone who could counter her intimidation with authority rather than fear, and that thought, small but steady, kept me rooted in the middle of the storm that was unfolding around me. I tried to maintain a calm exterior, gesturing toward the papers and muttering something about tidying up, hoping she would be distracted long enough for me to regroup, but she ignored my attempt at diplomacy, launching instead into a detailed tirade about HOA violations, about complaints she had received from neighbors, about permits she claimed I had neglected, all delivered with a fervor that made my head spin. And as I watched her, I felt a strange mixture of anger and disbelief, anger at her audacity, disbelief that someone could be so relentless, and at the same time I could not deny the surge of adrenaline that sharpened my senses, making me notice every tick of her watch, every scratch of her pen, every impatient shift of her weight, because each movement became part of a pattern I needed to understand in order to survive this confrontation without losing control. I could feel the cabin shrinking around me, the walls closing in under the pressure of her presence, and my hands trembled slightly as I straightened the papers on the desk, trying to create a sense of order amidst the chaos she brought in like a storm. And then, just as I thought I might collapse under the tension, I heard a second set of footsteps, slower, deliberate, heavier, approaching from outside, and my heart leapt because I recognized them immediately. The sound that had been my secret. Hope, the signal that help and authority were on the way, that the confrontation might be contained before it spiraled completely out of control. And I glanced toward the door, trying to mask the relief in my expression as Karen's tirade continued, unaware that she was no longer the only force in the room, and I felt my pulse spike in anticipation, knowing that when this new figure entered, the dynamic would shift entirely, that Karen's confidence would be tested against someone whose power was real, undeniable, and not subject to the petty whims of a neighborhood watchdog. As I shifted slightly to face the window, my mind raced through scenarios, calculating Karen's possible reactions, imagining her outrage when she realized she could not intimidate the person I was about to meet, picturing the clash of personalities that would unfold like a high-stakes chess game in the middle of my living room. And even as my stomach knotted with anxiety, I recognized a strange thrill in the anticipation, a sense that this confrontation, though terrifying, might finally tip the balance of power in my favor, that the scales might be set straight, and that I could witness, in real time, the unraveling of Karen's self-assured tyranny. Karen, sensing my distraction, spun toward me, eyes narrowing as if reading my thoughts, and she began to raise her voice, accusing me of hiding things, of manipulating situations, of thinking I was above the rules she enforced, and I felt the heat rise in my face, a mixture of fear and righteous indignation, because I knew every word she uttered was based on a distorted perception of control. Yet at the same time I could not afford to lose composure, to allow her to dictate the tempo of this confrontation, and I took a slow, steadying breath, reminding myself that patience was my weapon, that the authority I had invited into the cabin would speak louder than any shout, any demand, any tantrum she attempted to unleash, and I focused on the door again, imagining the moment when it would swing open, when the balance would finally shift, and I pictured the calm, controlled presence of the state attorney general entering the room, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable, and I felt a surge of hope so strong it nearly steadied my shaking hands, because I knew that once he was inside, Karen's bravado would crumble, her energy would falter, and the power she wielded through fear alone would be neutralized, replaced by facts, authority, and law, and in that instant, I realized that this confrontation was no longer just about defending my cabin or my peace of mind. It was about witnessing the moment where intimidation met truth, where fear collided with power, where the little tyrant of the HOA would face something far greater than herself. And as Karen's voice reached a new pitch, shrill and demanding, I braced myself, gripping the edge of the desk, every nerve on edge, heart hammering with the knowledge that the decisive moment was about to arrive, and that everything I had prepared, every careful precaution, every hidden document, every ounce of composure, would be tested in the seconds that were counting down to the arrival of the person who could change everything. And I felt a mixture of dread and exhilaration, knowing that in moments, the dynamic of the room would shift completely, and the confrontation that had seemed impossible to survive might not only be manageable but might finally turn in my favor. The front door opened, wider than expected, and before I could react, Karen's eyes locked onto mine with a combination of suspicion and triumph, as if she had already won some imaginary victory, and she stepped fully into the cabin, clipboard held like a shield, her presence filling the room with the kind of energy that made the air feel heavier, charged with confrontation. And I could feel my pulse quicken, my hands tightening around the edge of the desk as she began pacing, muttering rules, citations, and complaints, none of which made any sense in the way she delivered them. And then she stopped abruptly, as if sensing I was hiding something, and her gaze sharpened, sweeping over the papers I had meticulously organized in the small folder tucked in plain sight. And I could see the calculation in her eyes, the immediate suspicion that I was trying to manipulate her. And I realized that she wasn't just here to enforce rules, she was here to dominate, to assert herself over every inch of my sanctuary, and the thought made my stomach churn with a mixture of anger and dread, because I had never seen someone so determined to invade another person's peace. And yet even as fear rose in my chest, I felt a flicker of strategy, reminding myself that the moment she overreached, her own flaws could be used against her, that patience and timing could turn the tables, and just as I gathered my thoughts, a knock sounded behind her, sharp but controlled, and I felt my heart leap, knowing the decisive shift was coming, and before she could react, the cabin door swung open, and the state attorney general stepped inside, tall and composed, carrying only a briefcase and a presence that immediately altered the room's atmosphere, and Karen froze, her mouth slightly open, eyes narrowing as if the sight of him had broken her concentration, and I could feel the tension spike, every muscle in my body alert, because now the power dynamic had changed in ways I could barely process. The woman, who had seemed unstoppable, was suddenly vulnerable, and I watched her take a tentative step backward, realizing she had underestimated the reach and authority of the person I had invited. And as he greeted me with a calm nod, Karen's voice faltered, stammering a question about rules she had once wielded like a weapon. And I felt a surge of relief mixed with apprehension, because I knew this confrontation was far from over, that she would not surrender easily. And as she tried to rally, pointing to the documents and shouting about imaginary infractions, the Attorney General responded with a measured, almost surgical precision, outlining the limits of her authority, citing regulations and precedents that made her protests crumble under the weight of undeniable fact. And I watched, riveted, as her confidence wavered, her usual bluster replaced with irritation, confusion, and an almost human vulnerability I had never seen in her before. And in that moment, I realized the emotional stakes were higher than I had anticipated. that Karen's need to assert control had become a personal vendetta against me, against anyone who dared enjoy their property without fear of constant oversight, and that her presence here was more than bureaucracy. It was a challenge to my dignity, my patience, and my ability to stand my ground. The room felt smaller, the air denser, every glance between them like a spark threatening to ignite. And as Karen tried one more desperate tactic, leaning closer, waving her pen like a sword, I caught the subtle shift in the Attorney General's demeanor, the slight tightening of his jaw, the precise calm in his voice that signaled he was not merely defending rules but preparing to expose the overreach she had cultivated for months. And I realized that the battle was no longer abstract or theoretical. It was immediate, personal, and potentially devastating, because Karen had crossed a line she had never intended to, stepping into a space where authority and law outweighed her petty power. And the thought made my pulse race with both fear and exhilaration. I could feel my own emotions teetering, the adrenaline sharpening every sense, my eyes darting between her rigid posture and his composed presence, noticing how she clenched her fists slightly, how her shoulders stiffened, how her words became faster and less coherent, as if the certainty she relied on was crumbling in real time, and the cabin itself seemed to shrink under the intensity, walls echoing every sharp syllable, the polished wood floor reflecting not just the sunlight but the energy of a confrontation that had escalated far beyond ordinary neighbor disputes. Karen, sensing that her usual tactics were failing, began pointing out imagined violations with increasing desperation, trying to fabricate evidence from my carefully arranged documents, and I felt my chest tighten, knowing one false move could spiral into chaos. And yet I also felt an undeniable sense of empowerment, because I had orchestrated a situation where truth and authority would prevail, where her intimidation could no longer dominate the narrative. And I could see the moment her inner calculation shifted from confidence to panic as the Attorney General methodically dismantled each argument she presented, citing regulations she had misinterpreted, exposing inconsistencies she had relied on to intimidate, and revealing the reality that her power was only as strong as people allowed it to be, which in this room, in this moment, was no longer enough. As the exchange continued, Karen's frustration became palpable, every movement sharper, every word louder yet weaker, as if shouting could reclaim what reason had stripped from her. And I felt a mix of fear and triumph, understanding that this confrontation was as much about witnessing her unravel as it was about protecting my cabin and my peace, and I realized the emotional tension had reached a level where even my breathing felt measured. Each inhale and exhale a small act of control in the midst of chaos. And then, when I thought the storm had reached its peak, she lunged forward, gesturing wildly toward a corner of the cabin, accusing me of hiding more documents, more evidence, as if inventing a violation could somehow shift the outcome in her favor. And for a terrifying instant I felt my carefully constructed plan might fail, until the Attorney General's gaze met hers directly, calm and unyielding, and she froze, the weight of authority and undeniable truth pinning her in place. And in that split second, I understood the full impact of the situation, that the confrontation had evolved into a revelation, exposing not just her obsession with control but her vulnerability when confronted with facts and real power. And I felt my heartbeat settle slightly, relief and anticipation mingling as the first cracks of resolution appeared in the tension, even while Karen's anger simmered, her eyes darting for an opening. And I knew that what would come next could either escalate into a final blowout or tip the balance completely in my favor, and the knowledge of that uncertainty kept me on edge, ready for every twist, every maneuver, every desperate attempt to reclaim dominance, as the cabin itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the confrontation to reach its dramatic conclusion, a battle of authority, fear, and truth that had transformed my peaceful retreat into the stage for a personal and unforgettable showdown. Karen's eyes narrowed to slits, her voice rising again in a desperate flurry of accusations, but this time something in her posture had shifted, a subtle tremor in her hands, a stiffness in her shoulders, as if she were sensing for the first time that the tide was turning. And I felt a jolt of both anxiety and hope, because the realization that she might actually be losing control sent adrenaline coursing through me, while reminding me that her next move could be unpredictable, dangerous in its own small, petty way. And then it happened, a sudden, almost imperceptible pause in her barrage as the Attorney General stepped closer to the center of the cabin. His voice calm, deliberate, and precise, outlining each limit of her authority with a clarity that made every word she had shouted feel flimsy. And the air seemed to crackle with tension as the weight of undeniable truth settled over the room, pressing against her like a physical force, and I watched her falter, blinking rapidly, a flash of panic crossing her face as she realized that all her rehearsed lines, all her threats, all the imagined leverage she carried into this cabin were meaningless against someone who not only knew the law but embodied it. And in that instant, the entire dynamic shifted, the room itself feeling different, charged not with fear but with revelation. Because Karen's confidence was no longer armor, it was vulnerability, and I could see it in every tremor, every glance she threw my way, every futile wave of her pen as if it might somehow resurrect the control slipping through her fingers, and I felt my own heartbeat spike, half relief, half disbelief, because I had never expected to witness the unraveling of someone so relentless, so sure of her authority, and yet here she was, confronting a reality that was beyond her reach, and the tension hit its peak when she suddenly jabbed a finger at the stack of documents I had left in plain sight, accusing me of deceit, of hiding violations, of attempting to manipulate the situation, and I felt the familiar coil of fear tighten in my stomach, because even with the Attorney General here, I knew Karen could push the wrong button, create a scene that might spiral beyond anyone's control. But then he responded, each word carefully measured, calm but firm, dismantling her claims with precision and exposing the inconsistencies she had built her arguments on. And I saw her eyes widen in shock, the realization dawning that she could no longer command the narrative. And in that moment, everything shifted, the air vibrating with tension, the energy in the cabin charged with a sense of inevitability, because the person who had felt untouchable for so long was finally, undeniably, being held accountable. And I felt a strange mix of triumph and fear, because while relief washed over me at the thought that my cabin and my plans were safe, I also knew that Karen's pride and rage could still spark chaos if provoked further. And I braced myself as she stammered, trying to regain footing, trying to assert herself with louder, faster words, but the Attorney General's presence was like a dam holding back a flood. Every statement he made exposing the fragility of her claims, and the panic in her eyes was growing, raw and unpolished, a side of her I had never seen before, and it made me realize that this confrontation was not just about rules or property. It was about power, about the human need to dominate, and what happened next confirmed it, because Karen, in a sudden flurry of frustration, gestured wildly at the cabin, at my dock, at the garden, trying to cite every imagined rule she could remember, her voice cracking as she demanded compliance. And then the Attorney General leaned slightly forward, his voice low but unwavering, cutting through the chaos with a statement so precise and undeniable that it caused her to freeze mid-gesture. And I felt my chest tighten as the weight of the moment settled over us all, because Karen's eyes, wide and unblinking, finally registered the reality she had refused to acknowledge for so long, that she was not in charge here, that her authority was limited, and that there were forces greater than her petty obsession with control. And in that second, the cabin seemed to breathe with us, the walls holding the echoes of every accusation, every counterpoint, every sharp word. And I realized that the turning point was not a single gesture or statement, but the undeniable presence of truth and law in a space where intimidation had previously ruled, and the sight of Karen faltering, the almost imperceptible slump in her posture, the way she no longer paced but instead leaned against the wall for support, made my pulse race with a mixture of relief, pride, and lingering fear, because I knew the confrontation was far from over, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly, and I felt an unexpected surge of clarity, realizing that the battle was no longer about the papers or the dock or the garden. It was about witnessing the collapse of an unchallenged tyranny and the assertion of boundaries that could not be violated. And then Karen, in a last desperate effort, attempted to intimidate me directly, her voice rising, fingernails tapping aggressively on the desk, her eyes blazing with the kind of fury that can only come from a person whose sense of control is being stripped away in real time. And I felt my breath hitch, knowing that the next moment could escalate or finally settle the storm. But before she could make her move, the Attorney General's calm, unwavering gaze met hers, and I could see the moment it registered, the understanding that shouting, gesturing, and pointing were meaningless here, that authority grounded in fact and law would not be shaken by tantrums. And in that split second, Karen's expression shifted from rage to disbelief, her energy faltering, her words dying in her throat, and I felt a surge of empowerment as the realization hit me that this turning point was complete, that the imbalance had been corrected, that the relentless pressure I had felt for months had finally met a force it could not overpower, and even as Karen's frustration simmered, I knew the stakes had been raised beyond her comprehension, because from this moment on, every decision, every action she took would be tempered by the knowledge that she was not invincible. And as the cabin settled into a tense, charged silence, I could feel the weight of what had just occurred pressing against my chest, a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and relief, knowing that the confrontation had pivoted in my favor, that the moment I had feared and anticipated for weeks had arrived, and that the next steps, the final resolution, would determine whether Karen would recover her composure or whether the authority and truth present in that room would finally put an end to her relentless reign over my life. And as I watched her struggle to reconcile the collapse of her confidence, I realized that nothing would ever feel the same in this cabin, in my sanctuary, and in my sense of control, because the turning point had arrived, reshaping everything in ways I could not yet fully predict. And I braced myself for what was coming next, knowing that the climax of this confrontation, the emotional and legal resolution, was fast approaching, and that I would be forced to witness the full measure of Karen's response to the undeniable reality she now faced. Karen's face twisted as if she were trying to scream, argue, and defend herself all at once. But the words got caught somewhere between her anger and disbelief, and I could feel the electric tension in the cabin spike as every inch of space seemed charged with the force of the showdown. Her eyes darting between me and the Attorney General as if looking for some weakness, some small flaw she could exploit. But there was nothing at all that she could use to regain control. And in that moment I realized that all the intimidation, all the yelling, all the threats she had used for months were nothing more than empty gestures against someone who carried authority and truth in every measured word, and the room felt simultaneously oppressive and exhilarating, every nerve in my body firing as I watched her flail with the last remnants of power she could muster, pointing at the documents at my desk, at the cabin itself, trying to assert ownership over things that belonged entirely to me. But the Attorney General remained calm, a wall of presence and precision, dismantling every accusation with meticulous clarity, citing regulations, precedents, and laws I had only hoped she would be exposed to, and as he spoke, I saw Karen's composure crack for the first time entirely, the rigid posture softening, shoulders drooping, the shrill edge in her voice turning raw and uncertain, and I felt a surge of vindication that mixed with adrenaline, my chest tightening with the reality that after months of her harassment, I was witnessing the moment she finally lost, and then, in a last, desperate attempt, she lunged toward the documents, her hand shaking as if sheer force could reclaim some measure of dominance, and I caught my breath, heart hammering, knowing that the next second could erupt into chaos. But the Attorney General, steady and unyielding, held up a hand, and in the calmest voice I had ever heard, he laid out the consequences of overreach, the limits of HOA authority, and the rights of property owners in a way that left no room for argument, and Karen froze mid-motion, the energy in her body shifting from fury to disbelief, as if she were absorbing the reality of being completely powerless for the first time in her life, and I could feel the tension in the cabin crack and release all at once, a pulse that left my chest fluttering and my hands clammy, because the climax of confrontation had hit with the force of a storm breaking over the lake, and I could see her shaking slightly, muttering under her breath, her clipboard clattering to the floor. A small sound that somehow felt like a victory bell in the midst of months of intimidation. And as she stumbled back toward the door, her voice a mixture of residual rage and humiliation, I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion sweep over me, my muscles relaxing slightly as the immediate danger passed, and yet even in that release, I knew the fallout would ripple far beyond this cabin, that her reputation, her sense of untouchable authority, had been fundamentally altered, and that for every neighbor who had ever felt her pressure, the echo of this moment would carry as validation, as proof that intimidation could be met and overcome, and I watched her retreat down the porch steps, muttering and spinning excuses, and the lake reflected the morning light as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed, because I knew the cabin, my sanctuary, was no longer simply a private escape. It had become a symbol of boundaries enforced and respect earned, and I could feel my heartbeat slow as the Attorney General finally turned to me, giving a small, approving nod, the kind of nod that carried reassurance and recognition, and I realized the stakes had been higher than I could have imagined, that the confrontation had been about more than rules or property. It had been about asserting control over my life, protecting my peace, and standing up against relentless intimidation. And as I watched Karen's car drive away, I felt the weight of months of anxiety and fear lift slightly, replaced by a calm I had not expected, a quiet triumph that was almost shocking in its intensity, because the emotional and psychological stakes had matched the physical presence in the room, and now the fallout was settling like a soft wave, washing over every corner of the cabin, leaving space for reflection, for clarity, for the understanding that I had not only defended my home but witnessed a reckoning. And I knew that the ripple effect of this moment would extend far beyond these walls, that Karen would think twice before ever asserting such unchecked authority again, and that I had seen, with my own eyes, how the presence of law and reason could dismantle even the most entrenched arrogance. And as the sun rose higher over the lake, turning the water to gold, I sat down at the desk, letting the quiet seep into me, my pulse finally slowing, every nerve tingling with relief and exhilaration, knowing that the climax had passed, the confrontation resolved, and the fallout, though unpredictable in how it might affect others, had delivered a clear message about power, control, and resilience. And in that quiet aftermath, I allowed myself to breathe fully for the first time in weeks, feeling both the exhaustion of the ordeal and the profound satisfaction of having stood my ground, having witnessed the unraveling of a tyrant's confidence, and knowing that my sanctuary, my cabin, and my peace had survived the storm, stronger and more untouchable than ever before. The cabin felt impossibly quiet after Karen's retreat, the kind of stillness that presses against your ears and makes every small sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint lapping of the lake against the dock, feel amplified, and I sank into the chair behind the desk, letting my hands fall to my lap, aware for the first time of just how tightly I had been holding myself for weeks, months, even anticipating her next move, fearing the constant scrutiny and relentless rules she seemed determined to enforce. And now that tension was gone, replaced by a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and a deep, almost surprising sense of triumph, because the confrontation had been more than a battle over property lines or HOA authority. It had been a test of my courage, my patience, and my willingness to protect the life I had worked so hard to build. And as I looked around the cabin, noticing the sunlight spilling across the polished wood floor, illuminating the papers and the furniture I had arranged with care, I realized that everything had changed. Not the cabin itself, but my relationship with it, with this place that had always been a refuge, a sanctuary, and now felt like a fortress, a place where boundaries were respected, where my peace was no longer negotiable. And I thought about Karen, imagining her back at the office, replaying the confrontation, her confidence shaken, perhaps even humiliated for the first time in years, and I felt a curious mix of pity and satisfaction, because I knew she would never again be able to impose the same kind of fear, and the knowledge that her authority had been exposed as limited, fragile, and ultimately subordinate to law and reason gave me a subtle but profound sense of empowerment, one that I carried like a weightless shield across my chest. And yet, even as I absorbed that victory, my thoughts turned inward to myself, to the months of anxiety I had carried, the nights of imagining worst-case scenarios, the mornings of careful planning and hiding, the endless preparation for a confrontation that had now come and passed. And I felt a tenderness for myself I hadn't acknowledged before, realizing that the strength I had needed to face her had always been inside me, and that the Attorney General had only amplified it, had only validated what I had already known. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And I thought about the way he had entered the cabin, calm and authoritative, how his presence alone had shifted the energy, how he had dismantled every attempt at control Karen had tried to assert, and I felt gratitude that went beyond simple thanks, a deep recognition that some battles require allies, people whose power complements your own, and that while the cabin had been my sanctuary, it had also become a stage where justice and reason could visibly overcome intimidation. And in that moment, I realized how much I had underestimated the psychological toll of living under constant scrutiny, how exhausting it had been to carry that invisible weight. And now, as the quiet settled, I felt lighter, freer, able to breathe without calculating every word, every movement, every glance as if it might be weaponized against me. And I thought about the future, about the way I would walk the docks, tend the garden, sip my coffee on the deck, without the shadow of her authority looming over me, and I felt a sense of reclamation that was almost euphoric because this cabin was not just a building. It was a symbol of my autonomy, my right to exist in peace, my ability to defend my life against those who confuse power with entitlement, and I allowed myself to smile softly, remembering the fleeting expressions on Karen's face, the moment her certainty faltered, the tiny tremor that revealed her vulnerability, and I realized that while fear had ruled her interactions for years, she was no longer invincible, and the ripple of that truth extended far beyond this cabin, far beyond the lake, reaching neighbors, friends, and anyone who had felt powerless in the face of someone like her. And in that quiet reflection, I understood that the resolution was not only about stopping her interference but about reclaiming my own sense of strength, confidence, and calm, about learning that confrontation, when faced with preparation, truth, and support, could yield not chaos but clarity, and that life, even in moments of tension and fear, can deliver lessons wrapped in triumph and relief, subtle but unforgettable. And I turned my gaze to the lake, watching the sunlight dance across the water, noticing how each ripple caught the light differently than the moment before, reminding me that change is constant, that balance can be restored, and that every storm eventually passes, leaving in its wake both the evidence of its force and the clarity of the calm that follows. And as I sipped the coffee I had made hours ago, finally able to savor it without distraction, I felt a sense of completion, a deep cinematic satisfaction that this chapter had closed with dignity, with authority, and with the knowledge that I had endured, that I had acted, and that I had emerged not only intact but stronger, wiser, and more certain of my right to peace. And in that quiet moment, I allowed myself to reflect on the way fear and power interact, on the ways people wield authority when they feel entitled, and on how truth, patience, and presence can dismantle even the most relentless force. And as the wind stirred gently across the trees and the lake shimmered like molten silver in the late morning sun, I felt a profound sense of equilibrium settle over me, a stillness that carried with it the promise of resilience, the quiet satisfaction of justice observed, and the enduring knowledge that my sanctuary, my cabin, and my life would no longer be dictated by anyone else, that I had claimed it fully, and that, in the end, peace was not only possible, it was inevitable when courage and truth walked hand in hand. And as I leaned back in the chair, letting the light wash over me, I felt the weight of months lift entirely, replaced by a clarity and calm that was almost holy in its intensity, knowing that what had begun as fear and confrontation had resolved into empowerment, serenity, and a profound understanding that some battles, when faced with honesty, authority, and resolve, do more than protect what is yours. They reveal the depth of what you are capable of, and that lesson, carried in every heartbeat and every glance over the lake, would stay with me long after the cabin returned to silence. The weeks after that confrontation unfolded with a quiet rhythm that felt almost unreal compared to the chaos of that morning. The cabin and the lake settling into a peace that seemed almost sacred, and I found myself walking along the shoreline at dawn, noticing the way the mist lifted off the water, curling in delicate spirals as if carrying away the tension that had lingered in my chest for months, and I realized with a deep, almost shocking clarity that the cabin had transformed for me from a simple retreat into a symbol of resilience, a place where I had faced fear and intimidation and emerged not only unbroken but stronger, more centered, and more capable than I had believed possible. And as I brewed my morning coffee, listening to the soft hum of the woods waking around me, I thought about Karen, about her relentless drive to control and dominate, and I felt neither anger nor triumph now, only understanding that her need for authority was a reflection of her own fears and insecurities, and that while she had been a storm in my life, her power had always been limited by the boundaries I was willing to enforce and the courage I was willing to summon. And that insight settled over me like a gentle weight, reminding me that peace is not simply the absence of conflict but the presence of clarity and the ability to act with integrity even in the face of intimidation. And as I opened the windows to let the lake air fill the cabin, I could feel my body relax in a way it hadn't since before the letters, the meetings, and the threats. a deep loosening of muscles and tension that made me aware of how much energy I had been expending just to survive psychologically. And I reflected on the Attorney General's presence that day, how his calm authority had not only dismantled Karen's overreach but also validated the power of truth and preparation, and I understood that allies, timing, and the courage to seek support when needed were as critical as the personal strength I had cultivated. And I noticed too how the neighbors, those who had whispered complaints or quietly tolerated Karen's tyranny, began to shift around me, their distance softening, their interactions warmer, as if the ripple of that confrontation had altered the social currents of the neighborhood. And I recognized that the events of that day were not only about protecting my cabin but about demonstrating a kind of leadership that is rooted in principle, rather than force, and that realization gave me a subtle but profound sense of purpose, a reminder that the choices we make in moments of high stakes resonate far beyond the walls we defend or the rules we uphold. And as I sat on the deck, watching the sun climb higher, gilding the lake in gold and amber, I let my mind wander to the months ahead, imagining the dock perfectly aligned, the garden thriving, the cabins across the water quiet and respectful, and I felt a sense of stewardship that was not about domination but about care, responsibility, and the quiet assertion of boundaries that allow life to flourish without fear. And in those moments, I also reflected on fear itself, how it had guided me, restrained me, and ultimately strengthened me, teaching me that confrontation, when faced with clarity, preparation, and calm courage, can become a lesson in empowerment rather than merely a trial to endure. And I thought about the way Karen's presence had forced me to examine my own limits, my own assumptions about what it means to defend your space, and I understood that the fear she instilled had been real, but the victory lay in the choices I made within that fear, in the deliberate, measured steps that led to resolution rather than escalation. And as the day wore on, the light shifting across the water, the cabin warm and silent, I realized that my life had subtly but irrevocably changed, that I carried a new confidence in every decision I made, a recognition of my own authority within my space, and a clarity about the power of patience, preparation, and adherence to principle. And I thought about the lingering sense of connection to this place, the way the lake mirrored not just the sky but the strength I had cultivated. And I felt a gratitude so deep it left me almost speechless, not only for the safety and resolution of the cabin but for the lessons learned, for the understanding that fear can be transformed into action, and that action grounded in truth can create lasting change. And as I stepped onto the dock, feeling the cool wood beneath my feet, watching the water ripple gently with the breeze, I allowed myself to consider the broader message of all that had happened, that life will inevitably bring storms, that there will be forces and people who try to impose their will unjustly, but that the measure of our lives is not in avoiding confrontation but in how we respond to it with courage, integrity, and readiness. And I understood that this moment of reflection, the calm after the storm, was itself a gift, a chance to integrate the lessons of fear, conflict, and victory into the way I moved through the world. And as the sunlight glinted off the lake, a quiet affirmation of endurance and clarity, I knew that I would carry this experience forward, not as a weight of memory but as a foundation of strength, a reminder that standing firm in the face of intimidation reshapes not just the immediate challenge but the way we inhabit every space we claim. And as I sat back, letting the water and light settle over me like a gentle reassurance, I felt a profound sense of closure, a cinematic calm that held both triumph and reflection, knowing that I had survived, had acted with courage, had protected what was mine, and had emerged with a deeper understanding of power, boundaries, and the resilience of the human spirit. And as the day stretched on and the lake shimmered in a way that seemed almost eternal, I realized that life, much like the water before me, flows on, carrying with it the lessons of storms weathered, and that in every confrontation faced with integrity, there is not only an ending but a beginning, the start of a life lived with clarity, courage, and the quiet, enduring satisfaction of having claimed your space, your peace, and your strength. And I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the lessons, the calm, and the triumph settle into every part of me, feeling fully, finally, the long, steady heartbeat of resolution and the quiet certainty that the sanctuary I had defended would remain not only intact but a living testament to courage, patience, and the transformative power of facing fear head-on.